So how does the metaphor translate into these new leadership models?
Well, first let me say that I like to use the operating principles as a foundation for developing culture of collaboration. And again, that's the end game in terms of what I see organizations needing to do if it's appropriate for them to have collaboration based on their business case. Um, it's if you look at Edgar Schein, who many believe is the leading expert when it comes to talking about culture, I like to look at the operating principles very much the same way that he looks at the underlying assumptions that make up the core part of culture's infrastructure. So you've got to really have the operating principles or the underlying assumptions, if you will, right. You've got to have them correct. You have to have them right in order for everything else to play out. And if you don't get them right, then it's a case of dealing with perhaps a lot of unknowns. Schein would tell you that underlying assumptions taken for granted can lead to disaster.
Mm-hmm.
Peter Drucker would tell you that culture eats strategy for lunch. So it's really key to really look at these 11 operating principles as really the foundation piece. The second thing would be to, and we've talked a little bit about this earlier, is to really treat these 11 operating principles as a collective. They have to be in sync. They have to be working together. They carry equal weight. And when that's happening, then you're going to get the synergies that one would expect from a self-directed team operating in real time. So again, the parallels between that global application and the soccer team on the field are direct and 100% in my mind.
Gotcha.
Then
Go ahead. I'm
I
sorry.
was going to say, and the third thing I would say about the operating principles is that they can be readily learned and they can be applied if learned. But it's going to take a mindset change over a skill set, if you will, before one tackles the application. So we're looking at really, again, dealing with these underlying assumptions that make up the core piece of one's culture.
Right. So, as a follow up, in your view, is there an organization that you've seen really execute well on team collaboration using some of these principles?
Well, I don't have firsthand knowledge, but I've been told that an organization up in Vancouver, British Columbia, telecommunications company called TELUS, I believe it is, has had some success. They will tell you straight up that they have a culture of collaboration, but I don't know what that looks like firsthand. So I can't go into any more detail than that.
Sure. No, I understand. Well, you talk about, these principles and the application, and they can be readily learned. I want to take the position of, I'm a leader in the business. How do I, where do I start when I want to build a team of collaboration to be effective? Where do you advise someone to begin to think seriously about applying these applications?
Well, it's important, I think, to really make a business case for the need for collaboration. I don't think I'm not quite ready to concede that it's the default response for everything. So making a business case is number one. Number two is, if it's a case of trying to pursue developing a culture of collaboration, that's going to be a major change initiative that's going to take some time, some investment, starting with education and training. And I would also underline when we're talking about training here, we're really talking about leadership training because it's it's going to be key for leaders who are trying to manage others in a culture of collaboration to learn how to effectively delegate. And I think that could be a problem going in with any kind of change initiative of this nature. Then third, I would say that this whole idea of changing one's mindset at the front end of a change process may be the biggest hurdle to get over. Again, because we're dealing with these underlying assumptions that are really part of the subconscious. And if you look at what John Katzenbach and Doug Smith said back in '93 in their book Wisdom of Teams, they mentioned that at the core, most people favor individual responsibility and performance over any form of groups, whether it be a team or otherwise. So we've talked a little bit about that before, but that's going to be the hurdle I think you've got to really tackle head on.
Right, and because this is a major change initiative, and change is hard, especially when there are a group of responsible parties. I want to move our conversation, because I know we're getting closer on time, to talking about a pretty influential soccer player in the world of soccer, and that's Pele. And I'd like for you to kind of explain the Pele story to our listeners, and as it relates to some of these principles, you talk about in terms of effective team collaboration.
Well, Pele it's an interesting story. I had a chance to meet him back in 1976. I was up in Seattle, and Seattle was hosting the what used to be called the North American Soccer League's championship game. And when I met him, I was really amazed by how small he was. And when I say small, I'm talking about his height. I'm about 5'9" or 5'10", and he was probably 5'6", maybe 5'7" at best. And I'd seen him on TV numerous times, like a lot of other folks, in World Cup competitions and in North American Soccer League game competitions. And it just kind of blew me away how small the man was. And so when I think about that relative to this operating principle that's described as number 2, understand that everybody can play. For me, that's huge, because as you all know, in many sports, there's a prerequisite. If you're not 300 pounds and 6'3" or whatever, you may not be able to play football. And that's an oversimplification. If you're not 6'10" and whatever, you may not be able to play basketball. So soccer, to me, opens up many doors for many people, including females, in terms of giving females the opportunity to learn a game experience that in my mind, is critical for understanding how to collaborate in today's world, where interdependence is the key. So Pele is a great example of what the possibilities are. If you look at what Thomas Friedman wrote back in I think it was 2005 in his book The World is Flat, he referenced again the fact that technology has made it possible for everybody to play everywhere.
Right,
and that's the parallel.
Absolutely, no, that's a very great parallel. And when I first became aware of Pele, I didn't know much about the game, but I was really impressed with all of his accolades as a soccer player, and he's obviously very admired in the sport. In closing, I want to leave our listeners with some takeaways here, something for them to really think about. And if you could give them 3 key takeaways to leave with our listeners, what would they be?
Well, again, I'd say first that there's a need to make a business case, and that doesn't have to be very elaborate, but there should be a need to make a business case first. Second, I would caution people in a way that is positive in the sense of giving people the ability to make sure they understand the inherent challenges associated with managing change, the change process, especially as it relates to this shift in the values that may need to be happening here. If we're talking about shifting from individual values to, let's say, group or collective or team-based values, that's going to be a big shift. It's going to take a lot of work for organizations to get through that. And then third, it's back to this issue of underlying assumptions and understanding that mindset before skill set is probably the best way to go in terms of making sure that your culture's foundation is positioned to support what's needed in terms of the value shift and the behavior change that's expected on the part of the employees.
Great. And, I want to just touch on something here. You talk about the cultural foundation and the behavior changes. Just quickly elaborate on that, because that's such a critical piece in understanding how to achieve success. So how does one go about identifying those behaviors?
Well, again, you have to go back to, if we're talking about Edgar Schein's model, you have to go back to what he would say. And basically, you have to go back and check your mental map. And your mental map is basically, the underlying assumptions that you have as a person, or that your team might have, or your organization might have. And so, for example, if you have, positive assumptions about potentiality of people, most likely they're going to play out in the kind of values and the kinds of processes and the kinds of behaviors that would support collaboration, for example. If you had negative assumptions about people, or your organization had negative assumptions about people, again, that's going to play out in a way that's not going to be as productive when we come to looking at values and processes and behaviors. So there is a direct link between these assumptions, this core piece of culture, and what you're trying to achieve at the front end, and as far as the kind of things you're trying to do, the behaviors you're trying to promote around collaboration, for example.
Right. I want to take a moment and thank our sponsors today, HMH Agency, Organization Systems International, Go Intellectual Capital, Perkins Coie, Osprey Pax, and Glenbrook Consumer Partners. Our guest today has been Windsor Jenkins, author of The Collaborator, Discover Soccer as a Metaphor for Global Business Leadership. You can find his book on Amazon. You can find Windsor on LinkedIn under Windsor Jenkins. And you can also reach him via email at wins@windsorjenkins.com. Windsor, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Really enjoyed our guest today, Windsor Jenkins. His book, The Collaborator, is a great example of marrying the game of soccer with leadership. He left us with a couple of key points that I'd like to reiterate. Number one, making a business case to really move towards having a culture and a more of a collaboration environment. Number two, he talked about specific behaviors. What are the behaviors that will be reflective and indicative of an effective team collaboration? His book, The Collaborator, can be found on Amazon.com. Again, you also can find him on LinkedIn under Windsor Jenkins. This episode, I'd like to encourage you to share it on Facebook, tweet it, share it with your colleagues, your network. Really enjoyed his metaphor for soccer as it relates to leadership. I'm your host, Enrique Washington. Thank you for joining us.